Okay, good evening. So, welcome to tonight's shir. The title is Prison and Punishment from a Torah Perspective. It's an absolutely fascinating topic, and the reason why we're discussing it this week, we like to always connect the parsha to a contemporary halachic topic, something sourced in the parsha. So this week's parsha, Parshas Vayeshev, deals with prisons. How so? Well, once at the beginning, once at the end. Because if you look at the first box, and if you're listening online, please email me at j.golker@gmail.com and I'll send you the handout. They put him in a pit. They put him in a bur. Now, a bur, in days of old, that was a form of prison. And in fact, later on, after the whole story unfolds, a story we're very familiar with, Yosef goes down to Mitzrayim, he's sold, he ends up in the house of Potiphar, and because of the accusations of the wife of Potiphar, he finds himself in prison. The pasuk says, "Vayikach Adonai Yosef oso vayitneu el beis hasohar." They put him into the prison, Makom asher asiri hamelech asurim, where other prisoners are found. Vayisham bebeis hasohar, and is found there. So it's a very good connection to discuss prison. And really, I just want to give you some facts and figures about how sort of embedded prison is into Western society and in all societies, of course. I mean, if you think about it, every civilization has devised rules for providing a system of punishment for those who offend society's norms. And prison is commonly used as one form of such punishment. To give you some stats, in 2024, here in the UK, where there are approximately 80 million people resident, how many people do you think are in prison? What's the prison population of the UK circa 2024, this year? So, amazingly, this is what I've just researched recently, it's approximately 100,000. It's gone up. It was about 85,000 in 2014. So in the last 10 years, it's increased by about 13 or 14,000. So we're close to 100,000 people in prison. Now, of those, by the way, just interesting, how many do you think are male? How many do you think are female? I'm not sure what to say. I was talking to my boys in school about this, to the guys I give shir to in base. So amazingly, the stats are 96% are male, approximately, and about 4% are female. So the guys in shir said, yeah, because they just know how to get away with it, and all those very interesting take homes, right? Yeah. But that's guys, right? So it's 96% a male and 4% a female. Now, astonishingly, in America, again, I'm not an expert on this, but just from Google and just a bit of research last night, approximately 1.8 million prisoners in America. It's down about 10% since 2019, so it was over 2 million a few years ago. But here's the interesting stat, that whilst the United States of America has 4% of the world's population, 20% of the world's prisoners are in America. So they incarcerate a lot of people. So it's a massive drain on the government, on the society, whichever, whether it's the UK or the USA or wherever it is, it's a massive drain. It's very expensive to have so many prisoners. And also interestingly, what emerges is that prison has a very poor record of rehabilitating its prisoners. Very poor record. And the way you measure it is in the reoffending rates. So the reoffending rates, and again, it's hard to get clarity on this, but approximately adults who are released from prison, the reoffending rate within a short period of time, within a year or so, is approximately, what would you say? How many crimes are committed for prisoners who are released? It's as much as 40% within a very short period of time, let's say a year or so, they have recommitted a crime. And if you then go to the juvenile crimes, or people under the age of 18, then it rises rapidly to something around 80%. So the rehabilitation effects of prison is poor. So that's the backdrop. Now let's discuss now from a Torah perspective. This is not a criminal law lecture, but this is a shir, and I want to just discuss what does the Torah say about punishment? What are the options, if you like, in the armory of Torah regarding punishments? So we know there are a whole host of punishments that the Torah has, and I've listed a few of them. So, for example, if you look at paragraph 2, the first is, of course, financial penalties. The Rambam says in Hilchos Geneva, Kol hagonev momon mishava pruta mala, even a tiny amount, a shava pruta, a very small amount, over alei sase. So a person who steals is over a lav, shenem aloi signovu. However, ve'ein loikin alav zeh, you don't get malchus for theft, shahari nitin l'tashlumin, because you can pay it back. And therefore, it's that's one of the exceptions to where you get malchus. Sha'ganav chayvo isater l'shalim, because you've got to pay back the money. Ve'echot hagoniv momon Yisrael, whether you steal from a Jewish person, or hagoniv momon goy avid avid zara, or you steal from a non-Jewish idolater, you are still chayev. Ve'echot hagoniv isagodle isakotnim, whether you steal from an adult or a child, you are still chayev. So financial penalties is one aspect, is one possibility. Another punishment, of course, is a korban. That's a punishment. The Gemara, the Rambam again says in the next box in Hilchos Shkagas, Parak Aleph Halacha Aleph, Kol ha'over b'shkaga al achas mitzvos lo yisaseh sheyesh b'maisa shechayav nolav kares har zeh chayav lahakriv korban chatzos. The korban chatzos, that is one of the most common korbanos. Another punishment in the Torah is corporal punishment. So the Rambam says in Hilchos Sanhedrin Parak Yudzayin, Keitzad malchus, lashes. How are you malkin the mechuy of malchus? Kafi kaichai. We know this. Ein roisifin al haboim. You can't ever do more than 39 lashes on a person for one crime. Afilu hayachazak ubari kashimshan. Even if the guy is built like an ox. Avol peichsin lechalosh. If he is weaker, then you go down. You assess him. You give him medical and see what he or she can take. So that's another form of punishment. And then I guess the ultimate punishment is the Mishnah says in Sanhedrin in the beginning of the 7th parak, Arba misas nimsru lebeis skidus reif hereg v'chenek. That's capital punishment, the death penalty. And there are 4 different types of penalty. Depends on which crime a person has committed. There are other punishments available, and that is chayrim or nidui. The person is put into chayrim means he's effectively ostracized from the community, and we don't do this nowadays. I mean, putting into chayrim nowadays is not quite what it was in days of old. But days of old, it was very, very serious, because if you were sort of cast aside from your community, that means you couldn't walk within daled amas of them, you couldn't get too close to them, you couldn't do business with them, you couldn't socialize, you couldn't go to shul, and it was to all extent and purpose like a form of a death penalty, almost as it were. You had to leave town because you couldn't do business. You there was no way of making ends meet. So there was that option available as well in times of old. Now, what's interesting is that there's one thing missing from that list. You've got a whole bunch of things. You've got financial penalties, korbanos, you've got chayrim, you've got corporal punishment, capital punishment. One thing you haven't got is prison. That's a glaring omission from sort of the Torah forms of punishment.
Isn't it when we were talking about Yosef?
Right.
I remember something about him being put into custody.
Right.
So maybe it's more like that's not the actual
right, exactly. I was going to say that. So very, very good, excellent. So you do find examples of a form of prison in Tanakh. We'll talk about a few of them, but they're not really prisons in the conventional sense. For example, perhaps what you're thinking of is a great example. I mean, you mentioned Yosef, so of course he's in a pit in the beginning of this week's Hedra, and he ends up in prison at the end of this week's Hedra. You've got Yirmiyahu, who was put in a pit. If you look in the second box, Kivo Yirmiyahu el Beis Habar, Velhachanuyos Vayeshev Sham Yirmiyahu Yomim Rabim. That's Yirmiyahu was a very bitter experience in Perek Lamed Zayin of Yirmiyah. But also in Torah itself, in Pasha Shlach Lecha, you've got the famous episode of the Mekoshesh. Now that's a good example of what you were talking about. It's more of a holding cell. How so? Because the Pasuk says, Vayu b'nei Yisrael b'midbar v'yimsu ish mekoshesh eitzim, in Pasha Shlach Lecha, bottom box, b'yom HaShabbos, v'yakrivu oisa ha'mosi mekoshesh eitzim on Moshe vel Aaron, vel kol ha'edah. They brought him to Moshe and to Aaron. V'yanicho osu b'mishmar, they put him in prison, ki lo peirash ma ye'oseh, because they weren't sure what to do with him. So that was a great example of a holding cell until they decide what to do with him. Yosef as well. He's in the bar until they decide, should we kill him, should we send him down to Egypt? Exactly. Now, there is another form of punishment, as it were, in Torah law, and that is avdus. Avdus means you're sold into slavery. Now, let's take a look at the top box on the next page. This is in the first parak, in the first halacha of Hilchas Avodim. The Rambam says, Eved Ivri, a Jewish slave, Ha'omer ba'Torah, ze Yisraeli shemachru oisoi beistin, al karche, he sold against his will. Or he decides to sell himself willingly. So how so? Gonav ve'ein lo l'shalim. A guy steals and he hasn't got what to pay back. Ein l'shalim misakerem. He can't afford to pay back the actual amount that he stole. Based in moichin oisai, based in actually sell him. That based in don't sell anybody else. They only sell a person who's committed theft. You can only sell yourself until you've got zero assets left. If you've got any assets, you've got to sell them in order to pay off your debt or your crime. Even clothes. You're only allowed to sell yourself into slavery if you really, there's nothing else left to sell. You've got no other assets. Now, this does not apply to women, interestingly. Also, a woman is not sold for her theft, and nor can she sell herself. So we'll discuss later, how does, what can we learn, what can the Torah rules of punishment sort of guide Western society? Well, this is lacking the Avdus avenue, if you like, is lacking, but it's less pressing given that only 4% of the current prison population are female. So, again, but that's something we'll discuss soon. Yeah.
Is this that through slavery they'll make enough money to then pay back?
Exactly. So they'll pay off their crime. So if they stole £10,000, then they've got to make it up by doing £10,000 worth of work and washing the dishes and cleaning the windows or working in the farm, in the field, or whatever it is. Absolutely. Now, just again, it's always important to mention this. When you talk about Avdus, I don't know about you, but many people think about, slavery has been abolished. It gets a really bad press nowadays. Surely this is, how does it work? The Torah can sanction this type of slavery. So let me just read you a Rambam, which is based largely on the Gemara in Kiddushin, but other places, just to clarify how Avdus, in the Torah perspective, is very different to the sort of slavery that is portrayed in Western culture and maybe even in media and other places. If you look in the Rambam in the second box on the second sheet, the second side, Muta, this is the Rambam in Hilchos Avod in Perek Tes Halacha Ches, Muta la'avod av Eved Knani b'farach. He's allowed to work hard. And this is an Eved Knani, by the way. This is a non-Jewish slave, a Canaanite slave. Va'af al pi she'adin kach, midas chasidus v'darkei chochma she'eh odem rachman v'roid tzedek. But in other words, yes, you're allowed to work him hard, but don't overdo it. Don't sort of be overbearing. Don't cause him too much distress. And you've got to give him to eat and to drink. From all the food and all the drink that you've got, you're having a Shabbos meal, and there's a first course and the soup and the main course and the dessert. He's got to have a little bit of everything. And they get to eat before you. So, furthermore, next paragraph, you're not allowed to be disparaging to him, to embarrass him in any way, either physically or verbally. And don't shout at him, and don't get angry with him. Speak gently to him and hear him out. Zarish Avram Avinu v'hem Yisrael sheshpir lehem HaKadosh Baruch Hu toivas HaTorah v'tzivosom b'chukim mishpatzim tzadikim rachmanim malakol. We're a merciful people. V'chem medosh HaKadosh Baruch Hu shesivonet lidames bohem. We've been instructed to imitate HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It says v'rachmav al kol ma'asov. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is merciful in all His creations. V'chol merachim l'olav shneim v'nusnach, etc., etc. So it's a different type of avdus that perhaps is understood in the wider world. So there's that option as well. And the last point before we just discuss, more broadly, is Ori Miklot. You might think to yourself, hang on a second, there is prison in Torah, in sort of Torah liturgy, and that is the Ir Miklot. The Ir Miklot is a city of refuge, and we're familiar with it perhaps, that a person kills B'shogeg, he goes off to Ir Miklot. Isn't that a form of prison? The answer is not really. Not really at all, actually. The Rambam says, this is the Rambam in Hilchos Rotzeach v'Shmiras HaNefesh Perek Hei Halacha Zayin. Betchila, this is paragraph 5. Betchila, initially, echod shogeg ve'echod mezid makdimin l'ari miklot. Based on the Gemara there in Makkas, the way it works is that anybody kills, whether it's b'shogeg or b'mezid, carelessly or intentionally, he goes straight to the Ir Miklot, ubeistin shel oiso ha'ir sheharag ba sholchin u'mavinu so misham v'donu son, and then he's called back for the trial. Mishin is chayiv misa mamisna. So if he's chayiv misa, because he killed on purpose with Eidim, then he's chayiv the death penalty. Misha nifta, and if he is exempt, he gets sent home. He's off the hook. Mishin is chayiv golus, machzir esonim komen. But only person who is chayiv golus, i.e. he killed b'shogeg with all the correct criteria that golus requires, then he goes back to golus. Now, it's very different because these are not really prisons, but they're sort of protective custody. Protective custody from who? The Goel Adam. The Goel Adam is the family of the person who was killed have got rights to attack and perhaps kill the Rotzech, the murderer. And there's a discussion in the Mishnah there exactly on what terms and what grounds. Is he able to, or is mitzvah to, or is obligated to? That's debated there in the Gemara. And moreover, the reason why it's not really prison is because the offender lives a pretty normal life. He goes with his family, and more. The Gemara says even that if he's a yeshiva bacher, the whole yeshiva go with him, and his Rebbe goes with him. So he's got to have regular life there. That moreover, there needs to be near market towns and fresh water. So it's like saying you've got to go to Manchester, you've got to go to Birmingham. That's your Ir Miklot, let's say. You're not in prison, you can live there normally, it's just that if you leave there, the Goel Adam can get you. So it really can't be described as prison. So there you have it. You have lots of different punishments from a Torah perspective, whether it's financial, carbonus, corporal, capital, some form of avdus, or Ir Miklot is some form of punishment, but nothing really comes close to prison. Now, here's the interesting thing. What is the purpose of prison? Why do Western societies go for prison? What is the objective of prison? So, if you think about it, there are a few objectives. What would you say? Why do we lock away criminals? People safe, right? It says protection of society. That's one aspect. You don't want people who are very dangerous out on the streets. So that's number one.
I think it's mainly punishment.
Punishment. Okay. What punishment? What exactly does that mean? Yeah. So okay, good. So that's interesting. So first of all, okay, let's start with deterrent. What does that mean? Deterrent means that you can't get away with it. You know that if you will commit a certain crime, and it's quite a serious crime, then a person could go to prison. So it's a deterrent against committing that criminal activity. The punishment, how do you understand that?
I see it as very the same really, because it's a deterrent because people know that if they're going to commit serious crimes, they are going to end up in prison, and that in itself is a punishment because you don't have your whole yeshiva and everything with you, or and it's not nice terrible conditions.
So the punishment could be some sort of either it's a sort of a moral message to the whole community. This is what happens to naughty people, to criminals, or perhaps some form of atonement. That person needs some form of kapara, maybe. Okay. No, I'm just saying. What is generally what is the objective of prison? So I think there are many. There are a few. So right. So there's the as we said, there's the protection of society. There's the deterrence. There's the punishment. There's also a very important one. And maybe this is what you're going to say.
Well, I was going to say I'm not for some people it might not be a punishment. If someone's kind of living on the streets, and that's what's causing them to commit crime, and they're around really bad people.
Absolutely. And on the contrary, given that you know that you go to prison. Again, prison today in the 21st century is very different to prison in the 19th century, in the 20th century, and certainly earlier. Yeah, you've got rights, and you've got maybe an air-conditioned cell, and maybe you get 3 meals a day, and you've got television there. And in a way, maybe it might be more comfortable than living in your current existence, whatever that is. So there's that aspect as well. True. But I think another aspect of prison is rehabilitation. That its objective is, you've got a person who's committing crimes. We need to rehabilitate the offender, to educate him and to help him not reoffend. So those are all the roles, if you like, of prison from a Western perspective, or just not, I wouldn't say Western, it's sort of worldwide, really. Why do you send what is the role of prison? What are the objectives of prison? So we've seen there are a few. Number one, there's protection of society, there's deterrent, there's punishment, there's rehabilitation. Now what's fascinating is then we put on our Torah perspective again, and we think, well, how does Torah, if you like, deal with these objectives of prison? So for example, protection of society. Well, protection of society, if you've got a person in a Torah system who's committing heinous crimes, well, one way you protect society is by, if they're chayav misa, then you can actually kill them. And in terms of a deterrent, if you've got murderers out there, they know that if there's capital punishment, that itself is a very strong deterrent. And yes, of course, the Gemara says in Makkas that a beis din that kills once in every 7 years, or according to other opinions, 70 years, is called chavlonis, is called a bloodthirsty beis din. So it was never the norm to kill people, but it's there, it's clear in the Torah from a Torah perspective. And again, we don't do this nowadays, and they stopped doing carrying out capital punishment already before Chum by Sheni, the Gemara says, 40 years before, I think it was, the Gemara says. So for a long, long time, we haven't been able to do it, because we haven't got a Sanhedrin, we're not able to do it. But in concept, in theory, there's certainly a deterrent. And in terms of a punishment, well, the Torah's got a whole bunch of punishments, like we've said, all the whole array of punishments. And what about rehabilitation? Well, that's fascinating, because it depends what your rehabilitation is. If, for example, Gneva, you're thieving, getting them to live in a family environment where that itself is highly educational. This is how families should conduct themselves. This is what happens. The rehabilitation effect is very powerful. In fact, when I was researching for the shir, and I just wanted to get some stats, like I began with about prisons, it's fascinating, because the rehabilitation is much more effective when offenders have been given employment or education. Then the reoffending rates drop quite dramatically. So I think from a Torah perspective, the rehabilitation aspect is much more pronounced. I think there, yeah.
Is that what you're saying with slavery?
Yeah, so with slavery, again, you're living in a family, and that should be a model of an educational model of how to live, in a more productive way. So that's that is a form of rehabilitation, an educational rehabilitation program, not by someone coming into the prison and giving a lecture, but actually living with a family. Yeah.
But how do they determine who the person is, who he stole from, or do they based on the select the family that is good for rehabilitation?
I see. So I'm not 100% sure, but I think my understanding is that you pay back, you go work the person you committed the crime against. So if you stole from Reuven, then you would actually have to go work for Reuven to pay off that crime. Could he go elsewhere, earn money, and then pay back? Maybe. I'm not sure. Could be. Now, just a few other sort of further thoughts. And that is, so we've discussed lots of things this evening. We've said, what we've connected to the Parsha, and we've spoken about how you see prison in this week's Parsha twice, once in the beginning, Yosef is thrown into a bar. He ends up the Parsha also in a prison in Mitzrayim. And we've discussed how there are a whole array of punishments in the Torah, whether it's financial penalties. There's also something called a knas, that beis din have got the ability to issue penalties against the person. There's korbanos, which is a whole range of different korbanos, but there are many of them which are for atonement purposes. Then you've got the corporal punishment, malchus. You've got capital punishment, you've got cherem, and you've got a whole array of punishments from a Torah perspective. And you don't really find prison in there. That's the fascinating thing. And the other things that you find occasions of it in Tanakh, but those, like we said, are more like holding cells rather than actual prisons that we are familiar with. And Ari Miklat are not really prisons in the way we understand them. But what's fascinating is that prison, if you think about it, is quite contrary to a Torah outlook. How so? Because it's contrary to the whole goal of creation, that you can't really fulfill your potential of and make a Kiddush Hashem and paint your masterpiece, and because imprisonment limits a person's ability to function, to flourish, to use the resources, the talents, the abilities, the opportunities that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave a person. So if you're incarcerating a person, in a way it goes against very much a person's tachlis in life. So prison, it makes sense, if you like, that it's not really something which the Torah advocates. And interestingly, in Western society, it's not really working, prison. The numbers are creeping up. It's a massive drain on society. The reoffending rates are high. It's not really working. The drug abuse and the negative education of learning about more ways to commit crimes and becoming addicted to drugs and other things, it's very prevalent in prisons. So that itself is very interesting. And the rehabilitation aspect is really critical in terms of a prison. So I think it's just something very interesting to think about. Why is prison not really found in Torah law? And that's food for thought connected to this week's parsha.